I never thought I'd end up here, unraveling the story of my life to strangers. But when everything you know crumbles beneath your feet, you start looking for solid ground wherever you can find it. Let me start at the beginning. My name is David, and for the better part of my 27 years, I've prided myself on being a man of commitment. You see, I've always believed that marriage is about loyalty, respect, and trust, values my parents drilled into me growing up in a small Midwest town. That belief guided me in every decision I made, from my career to the friendships I kept, and especially in choosing my wife, Emily. Emily and I met in the kind of way you only hear about in love stories. It was at a friend's wedding. I remember standing at the edge of the dance floor, nursing a beer, feeling like I was out of place. Weddings weren't my thing, but the groom was a childhood friend, so I'd made the effort. That's when Emily walked in. Even now, years later, I can still see her exactly as she was that night. Graceful, confident, and with a smile that could light up the whole reception hall. She was the kind of woman who could hold a room's attention without trying, and when she sat at my table, it felt like I'd won the lottery. We talked about everything: life, goals, music, even embarrassing childhood stories. Before the night was over, we danced and shared our first kiss under the wedding lights. It was magic. I didn't think I'd see her again. We didn't exchange numbers, but a week later, I got a text. The bride had played matchmaker and passed my number to Emily. One date led to another, and soon, we were inseparable. I proposed 2 years later, and within a year, we were married. At first, everything was as good as I could have hoped. We had our routines: Friday night dinners at our favorite steakhouse, lazy Sunday mornings with coffee and the newspaper, and vacations spent exploring small towns we'd read about online. People often said we were the perfect couple, and for a while, I believed them. But marriage, like life, is a journey. It's not about the big moments, but the small ones. It's the look in her eyes when you come home from a long day. It's the way you reach for her hand without thinking. And slowly, those little moments started to change. It started innocently enough. Emily became busier, throwing herself into work and girls' nights. At first, I thought nothing of it. She'd always been ambitious, and I loved that about her. But then there were the other changes. She started keeping her phone closer, locking it when she never had before. Conversations grew shorter. Intimacy became almost non-existent. I tried to talk to her about it, to express my concerns, but every time I was met with the same response: "You're just overthinking things, David." Or worse, "Don't let your insecurities ruin us." So I let it go. At least I pretended to. But the more I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, the more I noticed. Small things became impossible to ignore. The late nights, the distant look in her eyes, the way she always seemed distracted. Looking back, I wish I'd trusted my gut sooner. Maybe it would have saved me some pain. Maybe I could have stopped it before it got so far. But I didn't. I held on to the hope that the woman I fell in love with was still there, somewhere. That hope kept me blind, at least for a while. Until one night, when a simple question changed everything. "Why is there a second phone in your car, Emily?" Her face froze. That was the moment I knew. My world was about to fall apart. And this is the story of how it did. There's a saying: trust is built in drops and lost in buckets. For Emily and me, the trust wasn't just leaking, it was pouring out faster than I could catch it. The day after I found the second phone in her car, I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my head. The stunned look on her face when I asked about it, the way her cheeks flushed, the hesitation before she stammered out a week: "It's for work." Emily never needed a second phone for work. She barely even used her personal phone for more than social calls or the occasional text. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with questions, but they all boiled down to one: what was on that phone? Over the next week, Emily's behavior became even more erratic. She started leaving the house earlier than usual, claiming she needed to run errands before work. Her girls' nights became more frequent, and she stopped inviting me to meet her friends, something she used to do all the time. When I asked if we could plan a weekend getaway, something to rekindle the spark, she shrugged it off, saying work was too busy. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, that I was reading too much into her actions. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. One evening, she came home late, smelling faintly of a cologne I didn't recognize. When I asked her about it, she waved me off, saying it must have been from someone at the office. I wanted to believe her, but the seed of doubt had already taken root. That was the night I decided to stop ignoring my instincts. The first step was finding an opportunity to get that phone. It wasn't easy. Emily kept it well hidden, either in her car or in her purse, which she now carried everywhere. But I was patient. I waited for the right moment. A few nights later, she came home exhausted and fell asleep on the couch. Her purse was on the coffee table, the corner of the second phone barely peeking out. My heart pounded as I reached for it, half expecting her to wake up and catch me. The phone was locked, of course, but I wasn't deterred. I took it upstairs to my office, plugged it into my computer, and started running a backup program I downloaded earlier that week. It took less than 15 minutes to extract the data, but those minutes felt like hours. When the files finally loaded, I clicked on the text messages first. The name at the top of the list stopped me cold. James. James was someone I knew, an old acquaintance from our social circle. We weren't close, but we'd hung out at barbecues and parties over the years. I scrolled through the messages, my stomach churning with each one. They weren't just casual texts. They were explicit, intimate, full of plans to meet and thinly veiled references to times they'd already spent together. My hand trembled as I clicked on the photos folder. There weren't many pictures, but the ones I found were enough to confirm everything. Pictures of them together at a hotel bar. A selfie of James grinning in the driver's seat of his car, with Emily in the passenger seat, her hand resting on his arm. It felt like a punch to the gut. I sat there in my office, staring at the screen, unable to move. My mind raced with memories, trying to reconcile the woman I married with the one on that screen. How long had this been going on? How could I have missed it? But then anger took over. I printed every single message, every photo, until I had a stack of papers that told the whole story. It wasn't enough to confront her. I needed to be ready for whatever excuses she might throw at me. The next day, I took the evidence to a lawyer. I wasn't sure what to expect, but he listened patiently as I explained the situation. When I showed him the papers, he nodded gravely and said, "You've done the right thing gathering all this. With this much evidence, you're in a strong position." He explained that we lived in an at-fault divorce state, which meant Emily's actions could significantly impact the outcome. I wasn't thinking about the money or the house, though. All I cared about was getting out of this marriage with my dignity intact. Later that evening, I decided to confirm James' involvement directly. I called the number from the secret phone, masking my own number, and pretended to be from his cable provider. When he answered, I heard his voice, friendly, casual, like he didn't have a care in the world. "Hello, this is James." My blood boiled. It took everything I had not to yell at him right then and there, but I hung up instead, my suspicions fully confirmed. That night, I couldn't stay in the house. I called a close friend, Tyler, and asked if he wanted to meet for a drink. When I told him Emily was cheating, his face fell, and he immediately said, "I'm so sorry, man. You don't deserve this." We drank and talked for hours, but the anger never left me. When I got home, Emily was asleep on the couch again, oblivious to the storm that was brewing. I stood over her for a moment, watching her sleep. How could she lie to my face day after day? How could she look at me and pretend everything was fine? But this wasn't the time for confrontation. Not yet. I had to be smart about this. The next move would be hers. The day after I called James, I couldn't shake the sound of his voice. Friendly, casual, like he hadn't just spent months sneaking around with another man's wife. It wasn't just the betrayal that ate at me. It was the brazenness of it all. These weren't strangers operating in the shadows. This was someone I knew. Someone who'd laughed at my jokes at cookouts and clinked beer bottles with me at football watch parties. I spent the next few days going back over everything I'd uncovered, searching for details I might have missed. The texts alone painted a vivid picture of their affair. Dates at out-of-the-way restaurants, stolen afternoons at cheap motels, and intimate exchanges that made my stomach churn. But it wasn't just the texts. The photos filled in the gaps. Emily sitting across from James at a dimly lit bar, her smile wide and carefree. A candid shot of them holding hands on what looked like a hiking trail, one I didn't recognize. I realized, with a bitter pang, that the reason I didn't recognize it was because Emily and I hadn't taken a trip like that in years. I started to replay moments from the past year, looking for signs I had ignored. Her insistence on taking personal days from work, claiming she needed time to decompress. The business trip she'd taken 3 months ago, one she hadn't even mentioned until the week before. And of course, the night she came home with that unfamiliar cologne lingering on her clothes. How could I have been so blind? The anger came in waves, crashing against the walls of my chest until I couldn't sit still. One night, I found myself pacing the kitchen, staring at the stack of printed evidence on the counter. I thought about confronting her right then and there, waking her up and shoving the photos in her face. But every time I pictured that scenario, I felt the anger subsiding, replaced by something colder. Confronting her out of rage wouldn't get me what I wanted. If I was going to end this marriage, I needed to be strategic. The next day, I went back to the lawyer. He greeted me with a firm handshake and a sympathetic smile, but he didn't waste time sugarcoating the situation. With this much evidence, he said, gesturing to the stack of papers I'd brought, you're in a strong position. But the way you handle the next steps is crucial. I need you to stay calm, follow my instructions, and let me do the heavy lifting. He explained that, in our state, adultery was grounds for an at-fault divorce. That meant Emily wouldn't have any claim to spousal support or a significant share of the assets. I wasn't even thinking about the money, but hearing that gave me a grim sense of satisfaction. After everything she'd done, she wouldn't get a dime more than she deserved. I'll start drafting the paperwork, he said, sliding a folder toward me. But I need to know, have you confronted her yet? No, I said. Not yet. He nodded. Good. Don't say anything until the papers are ready to be served. You want to control the narrative, not give her time to spin it. Control the narrative. The phrase stuck with me. Over the next week, I kept my distance from Emily as much as possible. She noticed, of course. How could she not? I stopped making small talk at dinner, stopped asking about her day, stopped pretending everything was fine. One evening, as I was sitting in my office, she knocked on the door. David, she said softly, peeking her head in, is everything okay? You've been distant lately. I looked at her, forcing myself to stay calm. Work's been stressful, I said. Her brow furrowed, but she didn't press further. Well, let me know if there's anything I can do. The irony of that statement nearly made me laugh. I focused my energy on preparing for the confrontation. Every detail had to be perfect. I double-checked the evidence, organizing it chronologically so there would be no room for denial or confusion. I backed up the texts and photos onto multiple devices, ensuring I'd have copies even if she tried to delete them. In the meantime, I started reaching out to people in our lives, close friends, her family, and even James' fiancée, Sophia. Sophia was the hardest call to make. I didn't know her well, but we'd met a few times at group gatherings. When I told her what I'd discovered, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Are you sure? She finally asked, her voice trembling. I have proof, I said. If you want, I can send it to you. She agreed, and I emailed her a few of the texts and photos. A few hours later, she called back, her voice raw with emotion. Thank you for telling me, she said. I don't even know what to say. I didn't either. There wasn't much left to say. By the time the lawyer finalized the divorce papers, I was ready. Ready to confront Emily, to put everything on the table, and to end the charade once and for all. When I got home that evening, I found her sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone. She looked up and smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Hey, she said. How was your day? Busy, I replied, setting my bag down. I stood there for a moment, looking at her, my mind racing. This was it. Everything was about to change. Emily, I said, my voice steady. We need to talk. She frowned, setting her phone down. What's wrong? I walked to the kitchen counter and picked up the stack of evidence, holding it in my hands. I know about James, I said. Her face went pale. Emily, I said, my voice low but firm. We need to talk. She looked up from the couch, her face shifting from mild curiosity to something closer to dread. What's wrong? I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I walked to the kitchen counter and picked up the binder of evidence I had meticulously prepared. Holding it in my hands, I felt a strange calm settle over me. This was it, the moment I had been working toward for weeks. "I know about James," I said. Her expression froze, her eyes darting to the binder. For a moment, she didn't speak, her mouth opening as if to say something before closing again. Finally, she forced a laugh. "What are you talking about?" "Don't," I said, my tone sharper now. "Don't insult me by pretending you don't know what I'm talking about." I set the binder on the coffee table between us and opened it to the first page, a printed screenshot of a text exchange between her and James. Her eyes widened as she read the messages, her hand flying to her mouth. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "That doesn't matter," I said. "What matters is that I know everything. The texts, the photos, the hotel receipts, I have it all." She shook her head, her face pale. "This isn't what it looks like, David." I let out a bitter laugh. "It isn't? So you're telling me you didn't send these messages? You didn't meet James at the Parkview Inn last month? You didn't text him about how much you missed him after your girls' night?" Her lips moved soundlessly, her mind scrambling for an explanation. "It was a mistake," she finally blurted out. "It didn't mean anything, I swear." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. "A mistake? Emily, this wasn't one drunken night at a party. This was a year-long affair. Don't sit there and try to downplay it." She stood up abruptly, pacing the room. "You don't understand. Things haven't been right between us for months. I didn't know how to fix it. And your solution was to sleep with James?" I shot back. "How exactly did that fix anything?" Her pacing stopped, and she turned to face me, her eyes blazing. "Don't act like you're innocent in all this. You've been distant, cold. You never even talk to me anymore?" I stared at her, dumbfounded. "Are you seriously trying to blame me for this? For your decision to cheat on me?" She flinched but held her ground. "I'm not saying it's all your fault, but you weren't exactly the perfect husband, David." I stood up now, my voice rising. "You're right. I wasn't perfect. But I didn't lie to you. I didn't sneak around behind your back. I didn't destroy our marriage." Her shoulders slumped, and for the first time, I saw tears glistening in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I know I messed up, but I love you, David. I never stopped loving you." "Love," I said, shaking my head. "Do you even know what that word means? Because what you did, that wasn't love." She stepped closer to me, reaching out as if to touch my arm, but I pulled back. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. "Don't do this. We can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes. Counseling, therapy, anything. Just give me a chance to make it right." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for a brief moment, I felt the smallest flicker of something, sympathy, maybe, or pity, but it was quickly snuffed out by the weight of her betrayal. "You had your chance, Emily," I said quietly. "You had plenty of chances, and every time you chose them over me." She sank to her knees, sobbing openly now. "Please, David," she cried. "I can't lose you. You're my husband. You're my everything." I stepped away, grabbing the binder from the table and tucking it under my arm. "You lost me the moment you decided to betray me. This marriage is over." Her head snapped up, her tears replaced by a desperate, panicked look. "You don't mean that. You can't just throw everything away." I turned back to face her, my expression cold. "I'm not throwing anything away. You already did that." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the card my lawyer had given me, holding it out to her. "Here's the number for my lawyer. He'll be in touch." She stared at the card, her hands trembling as she took it. "David, please." "No," I interrupted, my voice firm. "I'm done listening to excuses. Pack your things and leave. You can stay with James, for all I care." I walked out of the living room, leaving her sobbing on the floor. My hands were shaking as I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, but I felt lighter than I had in weeks. The confrontation was over, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I was in control again. After Emily left, the house was eerily quiet. Her cries had faded into the night, replaced by a stillness that felt heavier than the confrontation itself. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the binder of evidence that had been my lifeline for weeks. Now that the confrontation was over, a new question loomed. What comes next? The answer was simple. I wasn't going to let Emily or James walk away from this unscathed. The first step was securing my own life. The next morning, I called my lawyer, filling him in on the confrontation and Emily's departure. He wasted no time advising me on my next moves. "Freeze your shared accounts," he said. "She can't touch what's no longer there. And change the passwords on everything, banking, utilities, even your Netflix account. The last thing you need is for her to use any of it against you." By midday, I had followed every piece of advice he gave. I set up a new bank account and transferred my portion of the funds, leaving just enough in the shared account to avoid raising immediate suspicion. I also changed the locks on the house. Another recommendation from my lawyer, since Emily had effectively abandoned the property when she left. When I was done, I stood in the middle of the living room, taking in a space that now felt more like mine than it had in months. The evidence was in the lawyer's hands, the accounts were secure, and the locks were changed. Step 1 was complete. Step 2 was harder. It meant telling people, friends, family, anyone who might hear a twisted version of the story if Emily got to them first. I started with my parents. Sitting at the dining table in their modest suburban home, I laid out everything that had happened. My mother's eyes filled with tears, while my father clenched his jaw, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "She had the nerve to do this to you," he said, his voice low but seething. "After everything you've done for her?" "It's not your fault, honey," my mother added, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "You've always been a good man. This is on her." Their support meant more than I could say, but the conversation still left me emotionally drained. Next, I called Tyler, the friend I had confided in before the confrontation. We met at a bar that evening, where I laid out the full story, binder and all. His reaction was immediate and visceral. "James? Are you kidding me?" he said, his face reddening. "That guy always seems slimy. I can't believe he'd go this far." He took a long sip of his beer before shaking his head. "Don't worry, man. I've got your back. And I won't let anyone believe her lies either." The hardest call, by far, was to James' fiancée, Sophia. We'd only met a handful of times at group gatherings, but I knew she deserved to know the truth. When I called, she answered on the second ring, her voice polite but guarded. "Hi, David. This is a surprise." "I know," I said. "I wouldn't be calling if it wasn't important." I paused, steadying my voice. "I need to talk to you about James." There was a long silence on the other end of the line before she said, "What about him?" I explained everything. Emily's affair with James, the texts, the photos, the undeniable evidence. By the time I finished, her voice was shaking. "Are you sure?" she asked. "I wouldn't be telling you this if I wasn't," I said. "I can send you the proof if you want." "Please do," she said quietly. After we hung up, I sent her the texts and photos. It felt strange, sharing something so personal with someone I barely knew, but I knew she deserved to see it for herself. That evening, she called back, her voice raw with emotion. "Thank you for telling me," she said. I don't even know what to say." "I'm sorry," I said. "I know how much this hurts." We talked for a while, and I did my best to offer her the support I wish someone had given me. By the end of the conversation, she sounded steadier, though no less heartbroken. "I don't know what I'm going to do yet," she said, "but at least now I know the truth." "That's all I wanted," I said. With Sophia informed, my circle of support was complete. My parents, my friends, and even someone who had been blindsided by James' betrayal. They all had my back. The final step was letting Emily's family know. I debated whether it was even worth the effort, but in the end, I decided it was better to get ahead of the story. I sent a text to her parents, thanking them for their kindness over the years, but letting them know that Emily and I were divorcing due to her affair. Their response was immediate and apologetic. "We're so sorry to hear this," they wrote. "We had no idea. Please let us know if there's anything we can do." When I told them Emily had left the house, they promised to reach out to her, though I doubted she'd answer their calls. By the time I went to bed that night, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. The confrontation was behind me, the legal process was in motion, and everyone who mattered knew the truth. But I wasn't done yet. Emily and James had destroyed my trust, my marriage, and a significant part of my life. Now it was time to ensure they faced the consequences. Tomorrow, I'd start planning the next phase of my revenge. After Emily left, The house was eerily quiet. Her cries had faded into the night, replaced by a stillness that felt heavier than the confrontation itself. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the binder of evidence that had been my lifeline for weeks. The confrontation was done, but the betrayal lingered in the air like smoke. Now a new question loomed. What comes next? The answer was simple. I wasn't going to let Emily or James walk away from this unscathed. The first step was to secure my life. The next morning, I called my lawyer, recounting the confrontation and Emily's abrupt departure. He didn't waste time sugarcoating the situation or mincing words. First things first, he said, freeze any shared accounts. She can't touch what's no longer there. Transfer your portion into a separate account. Don't leave more than what's fair in the joint account. It could raise suspicion. I scribbled notes furiously as he continued. Change every password, banking, utilities, even social media accounts. Don't let her have access to anything she could use against you. Even the Netflix account? I asked, half joking. Especially the Netflix account, he said, his tone unamused. You'd be surprised how petty things can get in divorces. By midday, I'd followed every piece of advice. My bank account was secure, my passwords were changed, and I'd even set up two-factor authentication on everything I could. I left just enough in the joint account to avoid drawing attention, but moved the majority to a new account. Then I addressed the house. Emily still had a key, but my lawyer recommended changing the locks since she had effectively abandoned the property. By the end of the day, a locksmith had installed new locks on every door, and I added extra security measures, cameras on the front and back entrances. When it was done, I stood in the living room, looking around at the space that now felt more like mine than it had in months. The evidence was in my lawyer's hands, the accounts were secure, and the locks were changed. Step 1 was complete. Step 2 was harder. It meant telling people, friends, family, and anyone who might hear a twisted version of the story if Emily got to them first. I started with my parents. They deserved to know, and I needed their support. Sitting at the dining table in their modest suburban home, I laid everything out. My mother's eyes filled with tears as she listened, while my father clenched his jaw, his hands gripping the edge of the table. She had the nerve to do this to you, he said, his voice low but seething. After everything you've done for her? It's not your fault, honey, my mother said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. You've always been a good man. This is on her. Their support meant more than I could say, but the conversation left me emotionally drained. It felt like reliving the betrayal all over again. Next, I called Tyler, the friend I had confided in before the confrontation. We met at a bar that evening, where I laid out the full story, binder and all. His reaction was immediate and visceral. James, he said, his face reddening. Are you kidding me? That guy always seemed slimy. I can't believe he'd go this far. Tyler shook his head, gripping his beer bottle tightly. Don't worry, man. I've got your back, and I won't let anyone believe her lies, either. The hardest call, by far, was to James' fiancée, Sophia. We'd only met a handful of times at group gatherings, but I knew she deserved to know the truth. When I called, she answered on the second ring, her voice polite but guarded. Hi, David. This is a surprise. I know, I said. I wouldn't be calling if it wasn't important. I paused, steadying my voice. I need to talk to you about James. There was a long silence on the other end of the line before she said, What about him? I explained everything. Emily's affair with James, the texts, the photos, the undeniable evidence. By the time I finished, her voice was shaking. Are you sure? She asked. I wouldn't be telling you this if I wasn't, I said. I can send you the proof if you want. Please do, she said quietly. After we hung up, I sent her the texts and photos. It felt strange, sharing something so personal with someone I barely knew, but I knew she deserved to see it for herself. That evening, she called back, her voice raw with emotion. Thank you for telling me, she said. I don't even know what to say. I'm sorry, I said. I know how much this hurts. We talked for a while, and I did my best to offer her the support I wish someone had given me. By the end of the conversation, she sounded steadier, though no less heartbroken. I don't know what I'm going to do yet, she said, but at least now I know the truth. That's all I wanted, I said. With Sophia informed, my circle of support was almost complete. My parents, my friends, and now someone who had been blindsided by James' betrayal. They all had my back. The final step was letting Emily's family know. I debated whether it was even worth the effort, but in the end, I decided it was better to get ahead of the story. I sent a text to her parents, thanking them for their kindness over the years, but letting them know that Emily and I were divorcing due to her affair. Their response was immediate and apologetic. "We're so sorry to hear this," they wrote. "We had no idea. Please let us know if there's anything we can do." When I told them Emily had left the house, they promised to reach out to her, though I doubted she'd answer their calls. I also texted her sister, Lindsay, someone I'd always gotten along with. Her response was more personal. "I'm so sorry, David. You didn't deserve this. I'll always consider you family." By the time I went to bed that night, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. The confrontation was behind me, the legal process was in motion, and everyone who mattered knew the truth. But I wasn't done yet. Emily and James had destroyed my trust, my marriage, and a significant part of my life. Now it was time to ensure they faced the consequences. Tomorrow, I'd start planning the next phase of my revenge. The day after informing Emily's family, I woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. The immediate chaos was over, the confrontation, the evidence gathering, the initial shock, but the real work was just beginning. It was time to ensure Emily and James faced the full weight of their actions. This wasn't about petty revenge. It wasn't about stooping to their level. It was about justice. The first step in my plan was ensuring the people closest to Emily and James knew the truth. My earlier calls to friends and family had laid the groundwork, but there were still gaps to fill. I started by reaching out to mutual friends, people who had been part of our shared life. I kept my tone measured and factual, avoiding the temptation to let anger seep into my words. "Hey," I began during one of these calls. "I just wanted you to hear this from me before rumors start spreading. Emily and I are divorcing. She had an affair with James, and I have proof. I'm not asking you to take sides, but I thought you should know the truth." Most responses were filled with shock and sympathy. Some friends asked if there was any chance of reconciliation, but I shut that down immediately. "There's no coming back from this," I said. "Not after everything she's done." The reactions varied. Some friends expressed outright disgust at Emily and James, while others were quieter, likely unsure of how to process the information. But one thing was clear: their betrayal wouldn't stay hidden for long. Within days, the ripple effects began. Tyler called to tell me that James had been noticeably absent from his usual social haunts. Apparently, word of the affair had reached several mutual acquaintances, and James was no longer the life of the party. Sophia played her part as well. She'd taken the evidence I provided and confronted James directly. When he tried to deny it, she showed him the messages and photos, leaving him with no room to maneuver. "David," she said during one of our check-ins, "I kicked him out. My dad and brother helped me pack his things and drop them off at his house. He tried to plead with me, but I told him there was nothing left to say." I felt a mix of satisfaction and sadness hearing her story. Satisfaction that James was facing consequences, but sadness for Sophia, who had been dragged into this mess through no fault of her own. "You're stronger than you think," I told her. "This will get better." "I hope so," she replied. The next phase of my plan involved ensuring Emily and James faced repercussions in their professional lives. While I didn't want to cross legal or ethical lines, I knew their actions deserved exposure. I started with Emily. Through a mutual contact, I learned that her workplace had a strict code of conduct regarding personal relationships that could impact the company's reputation. I sent an anonymous letter to her HR department, detailing the affair and including some of the less explicit evidence. Within a week, Emily's position at the company was restructured, which I later learned was corporate speak for being demoted. As for James, I reached out to his employer, again, anonymously. His role as a middle manager in a local firm required a certain level of public trust, and his actions didn't align with that image. The fallout wasn't immediate, but I heard through the grapevine that his superiors were made aware of his behavior. Throughout this process, I focused on maintaining my composure. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the weight of it all threatened to overwhelm me. Nights when I sat on the back porch, staring into the darkness, wondering how my life had unraveled so quickly. But every step I took brought me closer to closure. Every conversation, every action reminded me that I was reclaiming my life, piece by piece. One evening, I found myself talking to Lindsay, Emily's younger sister. She'd been a surprising source of support throughout this ordeal, offering a sympathetic ear and even helping me sort through some of Emily's belongings. "I don't know how you're handling this so well," she said as we boxed up a few items in the garage. "I'm not sure I am," I admitted, "but I don't have much choice. I can either let this destroy me, or I can move forward." Lindsay nodded. "For what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing. Emily needs to face the consequences of her actions. And you deserve better." Her words stayed with me long after she left. By the time my lawyer finalized the divorce papers, I felt ready to face whatever came next. The paperwork was straightforward, thanks to the overwhelming evidence I'd provided. In our at-fault state, Emily's infidelity left her with little leverage. When the papers were served, she called me repeatedly, leaving tearful voicemails begging for another chance. I didn't answer. Instead, I forwarded each message to my lawyer, letting him handle any necessary communication. Sophia reached out one last time before she moved out of town to stay with her family. "Thank you for telling me the truth," she said. "It hurt, but it was better than living a lie." "You deserve to know," I replied. As I hung up, I realized that I, too, had found something I deserved, a clean break. It wasn't long after Emily was served with the divorce papers that the storm began. I had expected backlash, anger, even more desperate pleas. But what I hadn't anticipated was how far she'd go to salvage what was left of her life, or her reputation. The first sign came in the form of a call from Tyler. "Hey," he said, his voice laced with hesitation. "You might want to sit down for this." "What's going on?" I asked, already bracing myself. "It's Emily. She's been talking to people, mutual friends, and saying you overreacted, that the affair wasn't serious, and you're being vindictive." I closed my eyes, gripping the edge of the kitchen counter. "Let me guess. She's painting herself as the victim." "Pretty much," Tyler confirmed. "She's saying you've been distant for months, that she was just looking for comfort, and it didn't mean anything." It didn't surprise me. If there was one thing Emily excelled at, it was turning situations to her advantage. The rumors spread quickly. A few people from our social circle reached out, asking for my side of the story. I kept my responses short and factual, refusing to stoop to Emily's level. But Emily didn't stop there. A few days later, Lindsay called, her voice tight with frustration. "David, you won't believe what Emily's doing." "What now?" I asked. "She went to Mom and Dad, crying about how you blindsided her with the divorce. She told them you've been cold and unloving, and she only turned to James because she felt abandoned." I let out a bitter laugh. Of course she did. Did they believe her? "Not for a second," Lindsay said firmly. "I told them the truth, and they're furious with her." Hearing that gave me some relief. At least her parents weren't falling for her act. A week later, the fallout took an unexpected turn. Tyler called again, his tone far more urgent than before. "You're not going to believe this," he said. "What is it now?" I asked, tired of the endless drama. "James' fiancée, Sophia. She's gone public with everything. She posted the texts, the photos, the whole story on social media." For a moment, I couldn't speak. "You're kidding," I said finally. "No. She tagged James, Emily, and even some of their friends. It's everywhere." Part of me felt a pang of sympathy for Sophia. This wasn't the kind of attention anyone wanted. But another part of me, the part that had been betrayed and humiliated, couldn't help but feel a grim sense of satisfaction. By the time I checked my own social media, the post had already gone viral. Comments flooded in, condemning James and Emily for their actions. Some were from strangers, others from people we knew. "Wow, I guess you never really know someone," one mutual friend had written. "This is disgusting," another added. "They deserve whatever they get." The backlash was swift and brutal. Emily's attempts to spin the narrative crumbled under the weight of the evidence Sophia had shared. She called me multiple times, leaving voicemails that ranged from tearful apologies to angry accusations. "You ruined my life," she screamed in one message. "Why couldn't you just let it go?" We could have worked things out. I forwarded every voicemail to my lawyer without responding. A few days later, Lindsay stopped by my house, looking both amused and exasperated. "Emily's a mess," she said. "She's been crying nonstop, saying she has nothing left. She even asked if she could move back in with Mom and Dad, but they told her no." I raised an eyebrow. "Seriously?" "Yep," Lindsay said. "They told her she made her bed, and now she has to lie in it." It was a harsh response, but I couldn't bring myself to feel bad for her. As the weeks went by, the dust began to settle. Emily moved out of town, likely trying to escape the shame that now followed her. James, too, seemed to disappear from the social scene, his reputation in tatters. I focused on finalizing the divorce and reclaiming my life. With the house sold, I found a smaller place in a quiet neighborhood, a fresh start that felt long overdue. One evening, as I was unpacking boxes, I came across the binder of evidence. For a moment, I considered keeping it as a reminder of everything I'd been through. But then I shook my head, grabbed a lighter, and set the pages alight in the fireplace. As the flames consumed the photos and messages, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The past was behind me now, and for the first time in months, I felt free.